Welcome, everybody. We're going to talk about onboarding. I know it's a popular topic. Hopefully we can have a discussion that has value to you. I was just talking to Stephen and Claire about it, and I'll just say up front, onboarding, a conversation about onboarding with a large audience is a challenging thing because it's so different from one company to another. So I'm going to try to lay out some kind of fundamental principles, some of which you guys have probably already thought about or already doing. Hopefully I'll just reinforce how smart you already are and give you some insights and tips in my experience. And then we'll have some time for questions, I think, at the end. So for those I haven't met, I'm Dan Steinman. I'm Notion's customer success expert in residence, I think is my unofficial title. I've been around doing customer success, and by the way, when I use the term customer success, I basically mean all of post-sales, what we used to call post-sales. So I ran customer success at Marketo way back when. I was their first customer success VP, and then I've been at Gainsight for now 11 years doing a bunch of different roles and helped author the book, which I hope many of you have read. Thank you for taking time to talk to me today or listen to me. And hopefully talk to me as well. Prepare your questions, send them in chat, and I think we'll have some time at the end to get to them. So here's a loose agenda for the day. I want to try to define onboarding. It sounds like a kind of a dumb thing to talk about, but I think it's important to understand what it is that we mean when we say the word onboarding. This is a pretty important topic. Who should do it? By the way, there's almost never any right or wrong answer to any of these kinds of questions, but I want to talk about the pros and cons of who should actually be doing onboarding. When does it start? Also sounds like a dumb question. Starts when we close a deal? Maybe. Let's talk about that. And then I'll share some ideas on tactics and then measurements. So let's dive in. What is it? Well, when I think of onboarding, I don't think of just the process of onboarding. What I usually think about is how do we make the first 90 days for a new customer really, really, really good? Like if I step back and I look at an entire customer journey, let's say 5 years, there is still no question that the first 90 days are the most important segment of that entire customer journey. If you don't get it right, in many ways, not just setting up the product so that it works for the customer, but and the relationship and everything else that goes with it, but setting their expectations properly, building trust with them, and launching them to be self-sufficient. That's really what we want when we finish onboarding, is that the customer becomes self-sufficient. But I can't tell you how firmly I believe that a huge focus on the first 90 days is really critical. If you're not doing that, think hard and long about how you could evaluate and rethink about what those first 90 days ought to look like for a customer. And here's one of the key things that I've noticed in my career. This is going to sound kind of funny, but think about the selling process that a prospect goes through. And how do they decide to actually buy your product? Well, of course, there's a bunch of sales skills involved, but at some point, a prospect makes a decision when they're purchasing a product. They are usually looking at multiple vendors. And ultimately, their decision is at least somewhat, if not largely, based on which of the salespeople they trust. Because you can't know everything you need to know about a product when you're buying it, typically, if you haven't used it before. So you're believing one salesperson over the other. They're both saying our product is the best, but you're choosing to trust one of them. So with all of that trust in mind, they sign a contract. Now, here's what's interesting. What's the very first thing that happens to a prospect after they sign that contract and they built all that trust with the sales guy? They get pushed over to somebody else. They get handed off. Think about that. I've decided to sign a contract with you. I've written you a check up front for the first year of the product, using the product, because I've trusted you. And the next thing you do is introduce me to somebody else, right? So that handoff is absolutely critical because you have to somehow figure out how to keep the customer's trust. And in some ways, the best we can do is maintain the expectation level of the customer. More than likely, it's going to drop a little bit because that handoff is going to cause some kind of a drop. We can build it back up over time, but the best case scenario is that you don't lose any of that trust when you do that handoff. So think a lot about those first 90 days. What is onboarding? This is my definition. It's really high level, but it's the idea of getting your product into a usable state for the customer. It's not getting all the users necessarily using your product. It's not perfecting it in any way. Think about if you're a Salesforce user or CRM user, what does it mean for that product to be usable? Well, it means you can go in and set up the pipeline stages and activities and load contacts, et cetera. Some of that might get done during onboarding, but not necessarily all of it. So what I'm thinking about when I think about onboarding is how do we take what we learned during the sales process and turn it into a functional product that the customer can then be self-sufficient with. Often we refer to it as standing the product up. Now, there's a lot of stuff that goes into that. So let's talk about some of that, because that's a really high level thing. It's not all that helpful. So let's talk about some details. Now, here's where onboarding is kind of a tough thing to talk about, because for one company, it could be these 3 things, and for another company, it could be these 50 things. Here's a small subset of the kind of things that you might need to do to be successful in onboarding. Obviously, there's some configuration. In most cases, you're integrating your product with something else, some other products. You have to set up users. You may have to worry about APIs. Almost certainly, there's a security aspect to where does this fit into our secure operations world. Do I have to train users? Do I have to ingest data from other systems? More often than not, you do. It's got to be testing and validation. And if we all spent 10 minutes, we would add another 100 items to this list. There's a lot of different things that go into onboarding. And so I'm not here to tell you for your company what onboarding is. What you need to figure out is what are the tasks that get us to the place where the product is usable, configured to some degree to the use cases for that customer, and that they can then become self-sufficient with it. Because onboarding does need to end. It can't go on forever. You have to figure out how to end it. And the ending of it means that customer is going to have to be somewhat self-sufficient. Now, they're going to almost certainly have a customer success manager after onboarding. So they're not going to be completely on their own. But what we want them to understand is that we're going to set the system up. We're going to teach you what you need to know so that you can run the show. And then your CSM is there to help you, but not to do it for you. So this is a really big topic. There's so much that goes into it, but these are some of the things that you need to think about. Is it science or art? The answer is yes. It's mostly science, but because there are people involved, there's an art to it as well, because you're dealing with personalities, you're dealing with insecurity, you're dealing with people who are trying to build trust with you after they've trusted the salesperson. You're dealing with people that most likely are not the buyer of your product and have the ability, and will often exercise this ability to say, I don't know who bought this thing, but I don't think we need it, right? This is really common in our world. The buyer understands the value proposition, buys the product, but then hands it down to somebody else who may or may not have been involved in that buying process. That creates a trust gap that you need to fill. And the best way to fill that is execute on an onboarding, set their expectations properly, execute on the onboarding so that they can start seeing the value of your product. So mostly science. I think there's a lot of rigor that ought to be involved in onboarding, but there's an artistic aspect to it as well, because there always is when you're dealing with people. Okay, so this is probably a question many of you have wrestled with. I think some of you have actually asked me this question. Who should do onboarding? It's one of those big, never-ending topics in the world of customer success. Who should do renewals? Who should do upsells? Who should do onboarding, right? Those kinds of things, very, very common questions. The reason those are questions is because customer success is a new organization, relatively new compared to most. And so what should customer success own is kind of the crux of this question. This question typically boils down to one of two answers. Who's going to do onboarding? It's either going to be the same people who manage the customer long-term, in other words, the customer success managers, or whatever you call them, or a separate onboarding team. So there's pros and cons to both, as is often the case. That's why it's a continual question. If it was really obvious, nobody would ask the question anymore. There are pros and cons to both. And it does depend on company stage. The more mature you get as a company, the more likely you are going to be to have a separate onboarding team. We'll talk about that. Long-term likelihood is that you'll have a separate onboarding team. I think as far as I probably lost track of all of the public SaaS companies in the world, but at one point it was pretty clear that every single public SaaS company in the world had a separate onboarding team, a separate support team, a separate customer success team, a separate renewals function, et cetera. Right? Over time, you start to delineate those organizations. Early on, you typically don't. So let's talk about what if we have CSMs do onboarding. Let's talk about the pros and cons. The pros, first of all, at the early stage, this is completely logical, because the early stage of a company is what I call the jack of all trades stage, where we don't delineate different roles. We hire really smart people who can do a lot of different things and are really good at juggling. And we say, you sell and you do everything else, right? Customer success manager does everything else. User training, renewals, upsell, demand generation, onboarding, customer success, find case studies, get references, et cetera, et cetera. They just do everything. At the early stage, this is kind of the only way you can do things. When you have 3 customers, you can't hire an onboarding team and a customer success team and a support team. It just doesn't work that way. It does lead, if you have CSMs do onboarding, it logically leads to a better relationship with the customer, because there's only one contact. Once sales is done, there's only one primary contact that they ever have forever, because presumably that CSM is going to do onboarding and then be their customer success manager until who knows when, but for a long time. So you will build a better relationship with the customer if CSMs are doing this. Tied to that idea is that you're going to have fewer handoffs. Handoffs are really critical times, and they're perfect times to screw things up. The balls get dropped when we do handoffs more often than not. So if you have fewer handoffs, you're taking somewhat less risk, and that's a really good thing. So this is one of the reasons that companies have CSMs do onboarding, probably in some cases for too long, because there's a lot of good things that come out of it. But there's some downsides as well. First thing you need to think about when you're wrestling with this question is it really the same skill set to be the customer success manager and to do onboarding? Most companies, it ends up not being the same skill set. Customer success management is focused on solving business problems and driving value. That can be very, very, very different from doing integrations and ingesting data and setting up APIs and doing back-end configuration. Those are all things that typically have to happen when you're doing onboarding. I'm not saying a CSM can't do those things, but just keep in mind how many different skills there are involved. And kind of the next con here is this one, which is if you have one person doing what truly are multiple jobs, that becomes really hard. It becomes hard in 2 ways. It becomes hard for me, the person trying to do 2 jobs, and it becomes hard for you, my boss, to manage me. Like, let's think about it this way. If I'm doing onboarding and customer success, and that's going to cause me to contact switch a lot. Human beings are not great at contact switching. So I'm trying to balance these 2 things. Let's say I'm really good at customer success. On a scale of 1 to 10, I'm a 9. And at onboarding, there's some parts of it that I'm just not as good at. I'm not a great project manager. I don't understand integration really well. So now I'm a 6. So am I a good employee or not? I'm a 9 doing customer success. I'm a 6 doing onboarding. Is that good? How do you know? Do you average those two things? What if you have someone who's a 7 and a 7? Are they better than the 9 and the 6? Right? It's really hard to get a grip on whether someone's good at their job if they're trying to do two jobs. And the bottom line for me is this one. The metrics for the two jobs are different. And whenever I run into that situation where the core metric that I'm driving for one person is two different jobs, I need to separate those things because it's going to be really hard to manage them. Here's the bottom line of this one. One of the key metrics for onboarding is how long does it take? Now, we have to define what project start and project completion look like. But let's say we know that onboarding takes today on average 47 days. I want somebody in charge of onboarding that I can look at and say, we're at 47 days. This quarter, I want to end at 43. Next quarter, I need it to be 38. And the quarter after that, it has to be 34. Now, that's going to be really hard to do if that person also is doing customer success because they're not focused on one or the other. But if you have a team just focused on onboarding, you can say that to them. Today, it's 47. A year from now, it needs to be 34 because the metrics are different. Metrics for customer success are net revenue retention, gross retention, product adoption, some aspect of those. Metrics for onboarding are timeliness and quality of the onboarding, right? So they're very different, time to value, et cetera. That's what usually drives things into separate organizations, is that there are multiple core metrics. If you leave it in one person's hands, now you're measuring them on multiple core things. So that's pros and cons if you have CSMs do it. I know some of you are going to have questions about this. What are the pros and cons if you have a separate onboarding team? Well, some of these are just the opposite of what I just said. I mentioned this before. Most companies end up here. Sometimes for onboarding, it is a specific skill set. I'll talk about Gainsight, right? The skills of our onboarding team are very different from customer success. Now, there's a fair amount of overlap. Both sides know the product pretty well. They know how to use the product. They know the value proposition, et cetera. But I don't want my customer success managers trying to figure out how to do data integration with their CRM system, because that's not something they're going to do long-term with a customer. One of the biggest things is there's a project management aspect to onboarding that's a real skill set, right? Many companies, when you're doing onboarding, you end up with a project manager and a technical architect side by side doing that. And project management skills are really valuable for CSMs, but it's not one of those things that they go get certified on and then keep that certification up. It's typically not that way. So keep in mind that this is a specific skill set. This one sounds kind of weird, but it's easier to reach project complete if you have a separate onboarding team. Here's what I mean when I say that. Think about this. If I've sold you my product, I'm the vendor, and now I'm your CSM and I'm doing onboarding. So I'm your onboarding manager, and then I'm going to be your customer success manager, and we're working through onboarding and we're getting close to the end of it. And I say, hey, one more task and the onboarding project is complete. That's awesome. And the customer's like, what do I care? Who am I going to call tomorrow if I need some help? I'm still going to call you, whether you say onboarding is done or not. In other words, there's a good chance that the onboarding project is never finished if the CSM is doing it. But if there's an onboarding team doing it, getting measured on time to value and project completion time, they are going to make sure that the customer signs off and completes the project, because then there will be another handoff. Now, that's one of the downsides. You have to do another handoff, but it's really important to get in the customer's mind that we're doing a project and there are a set of tasks that are going to get done. And when it's done, and we're going to hand you off. That makes it much easier to measure. The downside of the onboarding team is this idea. It requires one more handoff, sales to onboarding, and then onboarding to CSM instead of sales to CSM, which means you have to rebuild trust again, because every handoff is an opportunity to drop the ball with regard to the customer trusting us. And then because there's another handoff, it becomes super critical for onboarding to do a great knowledge transfer to the customer success manager, just like we ask sales to do a good knowledge transfer to the post-sales team. So pros and cons, but just keep in mind, in the long run, you're likely to end up with an onboarding team, and much of that's going to be driven because it's a different skill set. Here's my recommendation. This is a really more of a rule of thumb, maybe. If the total onboarding process for you as a vendor is 2 weeks or less, I would probably lean towards having the CSMs do onboarding, unless it's really super complex, because it's hard with a customer to say, we're gonna hand you off from sales to onboarding, and then 2 weeks later, we're gonna hand you off again to another different team. So I just think, as a general rule of thumb, if your onboarding process is relatively short, then think about whether or not you could have the CSMs do it, because that has a lot of pros, as we just talked about. It may or may not work. Again, the complexity is the big factor. But this is just a rule of thumb for me. If I came in as a chief customer officer at a company and found out that onboarding is typically 3 or 4 days, I would almost certainly lean towards having the customer success managers do it, maybe with some kind of a technical overlay that they can bring in if needed. Okay, so when does it start? Sounds like a pretty dumb question. And by the way, there are dumb questions. I've asked some myself. Here's my mantra. You guys probably have heard me say something like this before. This is true of customer success. It's also true of onboarding. If it's not a slide in your sales deck, it means you're not doing it well enough. What do I mean by that? Well, what goes into a sales deck? Pretty simple. The slides that are in a sales deck are things that the salespeople believe differentiate them from the competition, right? That's why we talk about technology. That's why we talk about our product features. That's why we talk about our ROI, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things are because we think that differentiates us from the competition. Well, I'm here to tell you guys, all of you post-sales guys, don't you want your onboarding process to be something that sales talks about because it differentiates us? Same with customer success. So if sales isn't begging you to help them put together a slide that tells the customer what a world-class onboarding process they're going to go through, you're just not doing it well enough, or sales isn't aware of how well you're doing it. And one of the best things that this empowers is a good salesperson wants to do something we call the presumptive close. They love to say to the prospect something that starts with these words: when you become a customer, whatever comes after that, because they're presuming that, and they're putting that thought in the customer's mind or the prospect's mind that they are going to be a customer. And you want the salespeople to be able to say, once you are a customer of ours, the onboarding process looks like this. It's the best in the world. Nobody else does it as well as we do. Here's our ROI. Here's our time to value, whatever, whatever, whatever. Same with customer success, by the way. Once we're done with onboarding, we're going to hand you over to a world-class customer success team who's the best in the world. And here's what they're going to do with you. So think about this all the time, because one of your jobs in customer success is to force the rest of the company to be better at their jobs. And you want sales to be the place where expectations start to get set around what is onboarding, what's going to happen after we close this deal, if we close this deal. So that's why I like to say sales is the place that onboarding starts, because it does. Everything starts in sales because that's where all the expectations are set for the customer. So it's up to you to make it something that sales wants to talk about. It's up to you to hold sales accountable also for setting expectations properly with the customer. This sounds like a simple, trite statement, setting expectations. This is immensely important in a SaaS world, especially. Back in the good old days where sales closed the deal, collected all the money, and that was kind of the end of the financial interaction. It didn't really matter how high they set expectations. But today, when we have to actually deliver on those expectations in order to get that renewal, or to get those upsells, or to get the customer to consume more of the product so they pay us more, it is so critical to make sure sales is setting expectations properly. And that's not their job, that's your job. Ultimately, it's their job, but you need to be the catalyst for making sure that happens. Here's my suggestion for how you do the handoff. A lot of people will come up with a Google Doc and ask the salespeople to fill in the Google Doc. What is their CRM system? Who are the people we're going to be working with? What's the business pain that we're solving, et cetera, et cetera. There's no doubt you could put it in a Google Doc. Guess what? It won't work. Salespeople don't fill out Google Docs once they close deals. They're looking for their commission check and the next deal. So here's what you do. Say to the salespeople, that's fine. You don't have to fill anything out. I will interview you and I will fill out the doc. And I will learn something by interviewing you that you wouldn't have put in the document anyway. Now, this may turn into sales going, well, just give us a doc. We don't want to sit in a 1-hour interview with you every time we close a deal. Okay, that's fine as long as you really complete the document and give us everything we need. But it is so critical to get whatever sales learned out of them so that we can do onboarding and customer success really well. And that includes not just facts like what is their CRM system, but who's going to be the toughest person from a personality standpoint for us to win over, right? Those kinds of things typically aren't shared in documents, but they can be shared in conversations. This is also a way to get the salespeople really aware of what you do, how you do it, how thorough you are about doing it, how diligent you are about doing it. And that will help them to be able to talk about the onboarding process during the sales process. And then again, this is something I know you guys are all thinking about, but I'm going to just reinforce it to say the most important thing that you can learn from sales is what is the business problem that we're solving? Because that's how we want to configure the system in onboarding. It's also the singular thing that customer success should be thinking about every time they talk to that customer. I understand that the reason you bought our product is to solve this problem. If that's true, then here's what I think we should do next. If that's no longer true, please tell me so we can adjust our expectations and our plans. But solving the business problem for the customer, that's how sales sells the product. They prove to the customer that they're going to solve that problem. And that's how we generate value to the customer in the customer's mind. Remind them we're trying to solve this problem, and we have. And here's how we prove that. And here's the ROI. And here's the next thing we can do. So I spend a fair amount of time on this because it's so important. Get your salespeople to be partners, get them on board, make sure they're setting expectations properly, and learn from them whatever they've learned during the sales process. And they'll often say, well, it's just a standard customer. They bought us because of A, B, and C, which are A, B, and C on their first slide deck saying, here's the problem we solve. That's probably not true. Don't accept that. Push them harder. Okay, here's some tactics for onboarding, things to think about. Be really honest with yourself about how complex your onboarding is, because you need to set expectations internally and externally. So this is almost arbitrary, or at least it's individual for every company. How complex is your onboarding? That's like saying, how long is a string, right? It depends on what it's relative to. But think about it. Set out some kind of guidelines. What's the least complex product I can think of? Maybe it's a box, it's cloud storage, not that complicated. And what's the most complicated? Oracle database management or Workday or who knows what, right? Those are very different onboarding processes. And just think about where you fall. If box is 1 and Oracle is 10, where do you fall in that process? Because you need to be really honest with yourself about the level of skills that you need to do that and what you need from the customer. It can't just be somebody who's the point person. Maybe it has to be somebody who understands database management or accounting or whatever it is that you're selling to them. So be really honest in your assessment of how complex your onboarding is. I mentioned this earlier, but be honest also, if it's a complex onboarding and it takes more than a couple months, there's a good chance that you might want to have a set of project managers who come in and own the project. Project management is a real skill. It is not somebody who's smart with common sense, who likes customers and builds a good relationship. That is not project management. It is holding customers accountable. It is setting and resetting expectations. It's managing to milestones and checkpoints, et cetera, et cetera. It's a real skill. And you need to think hard and long about whether you need that skill as part of your onboarding team. I suggest, even for small projects, create a project plan. It'll give the customer confidence in you, and it will change. And it's hard to keep track of changes if you don't have an initial plan in place. So create a project plan, put it in front of the customer, say, here's what we're going to work through. Here's the milestones we're going to shoot for. Here's how long we think this should take. And I'm going to push you to get us to the end of it on time and with a high level of quality. At some point, you ought to at least consider this. Consider requiring your customer to physically sign off on the project plan and then on the completion of the project. At some point, it turns out the only way to get a customer to agree that the project is over is to get them to sign off, physically sign off. And if you have a separate onboarding team from customer success, you kind of want to do that to set in the customer's mind that onboarding is over. They don't get to call their onboarding manager tomorrow if they have a problem. They now have a new point person, that's the customer success manager. And a sign-off is a firm completion date, which allows me, if I'm running onboarding, to measure exactly how long it took, right? Because I have a start date and an end date, and that's 42 days, and our goal for this quarter is 43, so that's really good. Anyway, just think about this, because we're managing customers. Sometimes it's like managing third graders. We need to lead them down the path. We need to set their expectations frequently. And sometimes we need to say, put your fingerprint here because we're done. Do you agree? We've hit all of our milestones. And time to value is critical. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. It's not just completion time of the project, but something I call time to value. We'll talk about that in a second. And I've said this many times already about setting expectations. This is 80% of the job of everyone that's not a salesperson. It might even be a big part of the sales job. But once sales is over, what we're doing with customers constantly is setting and resetting expectations. It's so fundamental to our success. A few more things to think about. Make sure in your project plan there's some milestones and checkpoints. Unless it's less than a day, you can say we're going to start at 8 in the morning and we'll be done at 5 o'clock. You probably don't need a lot of milestones. But if it's more than a couple of weeks, you ought to have some milestones in there. It'll make you feel good as you check off those milestones. It'll make the customer feel good that you're making progress, that you're honoring your commitment to them, and that you're moving towards the end point. This is a no-brainer. If you have project management skills, you got to do regular status meetings to assess the projects and reset expectations, because they'll always go up. You're a victim of your own success. You meet expectations consistently, and you're building the customer trust in you. And the next thing you know, their expectations are getting too high. Now, I love high expectations because we want to be demanding of ourselves, but we need to make sure we can meet them. So resetting expectations is pretty important. And make it really clear with the customer what it means to complete the project. This starts on day one. Here's the set of things that we're going to get done for you. At that point, we'll be done with project onboarding. And here's a little insight. Many of you already know this. Customers will tend to drag onboarding out because it's their safety net. This is back to that trust thing. We kind of don't want the sales process to end because they've decided to trust the salesperson and they like their SE, and they would love it if those two people would do their onboarding because they already trust them. Now, that's not realistic, but that's kind of what they want. Same thing will happen during onboarding. So they're going to build up trust in your onboarding person because they know everything and the customer knows nothing. It seems like they're the smartest person in the world. They're responsive. They're on time. They're giving the feedback that the customer needs when they're asking questions, et cetera. It's going to be something that a customer wants to cling on to. And you have to realize that. That's why forcing them to sign off on onboarding is sometimes the only way to get them to agree that it's over, because it's their safety net. This is the person who knows everything. We're making progress. We're starting to use the product. We're getting value. Why can't my onboarding person just be my CSM? That's kind of what they're thinking. So just keep that in mind. the natural tendency for the customer is to drag out onboarding because it feels safe to them. Okay, measurement. This is going to be pretty obvious. If you don't know who Peter Drucker is, probably in the 60s, he was a really famous business guy. Still, a lot of his principles are in place with regard to assembly lines and manufacturing. But he said this, which has lived on forever because it's true. If you can't measure it, you can't improve it. A variation on this is, if you measure it, it will get better. Just by measuring it. Think about that. Just by the fact that you're going to put up on the whiteboard near the CEO's office how long onboarding takes. It will get better, even if you don't change anything other than the fact that you're publicly measuring it. So we have to measure onboarding. It can't just be, well, the customer feels pretty good, so let's call it quit. Let's call it complete. It's not hard because there's only a couple things that you're measuring. One is timeliness. Are we hitting our milestones, our checkpoints, and are we completing the project in the time frame that we told the customer? And if we're not, did we reset expectations for a good reason? And then can we call it project complete and still call it on time because we reset expectations? And the other aspect of onboarding is quality. So it's one thing to get it done on time. It's another thing to say, did we do it right? Did we get it right? At the end of the day, there's a lot of value potentially in doing some regression analysis on if you measure the quality and timeliness of your onboarding. It would be an interesting process to say, at the time of first renewal, let's look at our renewal rate and let's look at how well that correlates to the quality and timeliness of our onboarding. My contention is going to be that it's going to correlate. If you measure both of those really well, there's going to be a very high correlation. Your best customers are going to have your best onboarding experience. That's almost universally true. So let's talk for a minute about time to value, because this is something we also should measure. And time to value is not just completing the project. This is going to feel a little bit fluffy because I do not know what value means for any of your customers, but I think you do. And here's where time to value becomes really important. If you have an onboarding project that lasts more than, let's call it a month, your customer starts to get anxious every day that ticks off and they're not using the system, probably because their boss is saying, how are we doing? Are we using it yet? Are we getting value? Are they living up to their promise? So you need to measure something that happens before the project is completed. And that's what I call time to value. So I'll give you an example at Gainsight. At Gainsight, for our enterprise customers, our onboarding process is often 3 months or even longer because there's a lot of stuff to do. 3 months is a long time for a customer to have paid you money and not get any value out of your product. So what we try to do is we build into the front of our onboarding process some things that will lead to some users being able to log into the system and do some things. They can't do everything we've promised, but they'll be able to do some things. So if a customer can log into Gainsight in 3 weeks and look at our 360 view page, as an example, one of the features of our product, we can call that time to value. That customer is getting value that they didn't have before they bought Gainsight. And that happened in week 3. So that becomes our time to value measurement. What's really important is to figure out something that has value, how long it takes to get there, and then work to improve it. Just like you do with the overall onboarding project. Figure out how long it takes and then work to shorten that time frame. Same with time to value. That process I just described, getting a user to log in and use a particular feature of our product. If that took 3 weeks this quarter, how come we can't get that down to 2 weeks next quarter? Time to value, really important because customers stop worrying as much about whether the project is completed if they're using the product already and getting some value out of it. It's also going to be easier to get them to use the whole product if they've started to use part of it before you have the whole thing ready to go. So think about time to value. Be really honest. Think through what it means to deliver some level of value. Doesn't have to be complete value, but some level of value, and how long does that take? Timeliness is pretty simple, hitting milestones on time. That's pretty much all there is to it, and then getting to that completion date on time, because that's what the customer is going to hold you to. Once you put it out there, that's why project plan is important, because it holds you accountable, which then allows you to hold the customer accountable. Like, we agreed that this process was going to take 3 weeks if we partner correctly. I asked you for this data 3 days ago, and you haven't given it to me. We're pushing our project completion date out because you haven't lived up to your promise. This sounds like a challenge to be that tough with customers, but you have to be. The best customer success managers and onboarding people in the world are not unwilling to hold customers accountable, not unwilling to challenge customers. It's a real skill to do that without ticking the customer off, but you have to do it. So think about that. Quality, I think, is relatively simple. The only really good way I've ever figured out how to measure the quality of any services project is to actually survey the customers post-project. Just say, on a scale of 1 to 5, how did we do with regard to timeliness and quality? And you'll get a measurement of some kind. We hold our onboarding project managers at Gainsight accountable for both on time and quality, and we incent them. There's a bonus tied to them getting at least 4 stars and being within 3 or 4 days of their project completion date when the project started. So that's my only suggestion for doing that. Figure out some way to do it, though, because, as I said before, ultimately someday someone's going to ask the question, can we tie our renewal rates to the quality of our onboarding? You ought to be thinking about that, because you want to try to do that. Okay, compensation and incentive. I think that onboarding team, if let's say you have a separate onboarding team, I think it's absolutely a good idea to bonus them on what we would call successful projects, on time and high quality. I think that's a good idea. And I think those are the only measurements that really matter. I don't care about whether the customer's happy as much as I am about whether we hit the project completion date and we got a high quality rating when we surveyed them. Most importantly, probably, though, is not the individuals that are doing the onboarding, but incenting the leader properly. And I've talked about this a couple of times. We just talked about time to value. That should be an overall measurement, I think, across all projects. So that's a leadership measurement, as is how long does onboarding take, that idea that we can reduce that quarter over quarter. One of the things that happens, if you have a leader you can hold accountable for measurements like this, they will quickly figure out that they cannot improve as much as you want them to improve without pushing on other parts of the organization. So here's a perfect example. I say to my onboarding team leader, I need onboarding to take less than 30 days next quarter. The onboarding team leader quickly understands that there's no way that that's possible unless the product becomes easier to implement and easier to integrate. So now they're pushing on the product team to make the product better. This is a really good cycle. The more people you have in leadership who are pushing on sales to set better expectations, pushing on product to make it easier to install, implement, integrate the product, the better off you'll be. This is that kind of golden triangle I often talk about, the wheel of pressure, making other parts of the business better at what they do to make you better at what you do. And they have every right to hold you accountable in the same way. So think about that. And keep this in mind. This is really important. It's a company-wide challenge. This is what I was just talking about. You, as the leader of the onboarding team or the leader of customer success who does onboarding, make sure you hold sales accountable, especially include product in reducing onboarding completion and timeliness. One of the things I love is when cross-organizationally we share metrics, because that forces parts of the company to work together much more closely. So if you can get your CEO to make sure your product, your head of product, at least partially owns project completion date on onboarding. That's a really good thing. Now the onboarding team and the product leader jointly own something that they can work on together. Product can push you to be better at implementing the product more quickly because there's some little tricks and tips, but product also can make it easier to do that. These are the kinds of what I call healthy tension that increase the overall skill set of the entire company. Okay, summary, then questions. First 90 days are crucial. I think I made that point. Think long and hard about who should do this. There's no right or wrong answer, but you need to make the right choice for your company. There is real rigor required, including holding customers accountable and doing onboarding. And then it's a company-wide challenge. This is not something you want the rest of the company to say, well, that's the onboarding team's job. They got to get the customer up and running. No. Sales owns part of that by setting expectations. Product owns part of that as well.